Greetings, this is Junior English. I'm now speaking specifically on the Reading Writing Assessment Packet number 4 topic that you will be writing on, page 126, number 7. I'm going to help you outline that paper real quickly. I'm going to make some general observations about Calvinist theology, and more particularly John Edwards and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And then finally we'll get ready to watch and study the Crucible here coming for the next few days. All right? First of all, I want you to look real quickly at that 126 number 7 question. All right? Notice what it is that you are asked to talk about. You are going to look at a very famous sermon that not only was read and preached by John Edwards, but was also read throughout New England. Churches would actually have this sermon read over and over again. Okay? This sermon is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And you are asked to comment on whether you think this sermon would help people in those communities where they heard this sermon, help those people become more moral. Okay, so that's the assigned question. You have to take a position on this one way or the other. Now, what are we really asking? We're asking if the threat of hell in afterlife leads people, in your estimation, leads people to behave morally better. The academic way we say this, by the way, is the threat of hell a moral propedeutic? By the word propedeutic here, we simply mean inclining towards exhorting you to become more moral. All right? So the question becomes, do you think it works? Frightening people with the threat of hell. Do you think it works to make them more moral? All right? That's the question. And more particularly, the question is not what is your opinion so much on this topic, as much as it is, do you think that this sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, would have led those people of the Puritan era to be more moral? Okay? In other words, would they behave more morally correct because of the threats that are implied in this sermon? In other words, if you do bad stuff, what happens to you after you die? Right, snap, crackle, and pop, right? That is to say that's not a good project for you, okay? And with that in mind, then, the question for you is, do you think it works? Do you think it doesn't work? All right? Now, let's talk real quickly about John Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You may want to take a few notes here as well. Greetings, Mr. Denise. We're just outlining, that's okay. We're just outlining the project of tomorrow's writing assessment. Page 126, number 7. John Edwards is in the strain of theology, for your notes. Now you're taking in class notes here, aren't you? John Edwards is in the strain of theology that we know of as Calvinism, coming from a theologian named John Calvin. His view fundamentally of God is first and foremost not that God is a God of love, but rather God is a God to be feared. All right? Now the Puritans had what we call a linear view of eschatology. Now what is eschatology? The study of what happens after you die. What happens after you die? Fundamentally, there's kind of 3 answers to the question, what happens after you die? One answer is not really an answer. It's a non-answer, if you will. It says, after you die, nothing happens. You're kind of like the dog Rover, you're dead all over, and it's just done. Okay? The other 2 answers are going to be fundamentally about an afterlife view. One of those views is what we call a cyclical view. Okay? It says the following. You live, you die, and after you die, you go through some kind of process, and then you come back again into this world to start that whole process all over again. It's what we sometimes refer to as reincarnation or transmigratory views, all right? In other words, the idea is you've done this thing called living in this life, in this world. You've done this many, many times before. Of course, that word we sometimes use called deja vu, where you have this strange feeling like you've been here before and all of that. That, of course, is going to be part of this, what we call cyclical view, cycle. In other words, it's like a circle. You live, you die, then you live, you die, then you live, you die, over and over again. That's one view, eschatologically. The second view is the Calvinist view, okay? And it's the view of the Puritans to whom John Edwards is preaching his sermon. It's what we call a linear view. A linear view. You live, you die, and then there is some kind of judgment after death. Now that judgment can be both good and bad. If you've behaved morally appropriately, you have the promise of some kind of reward. For John Edwards, he would call it heaven. For those, however, who have not lived well, that is the hell that's described in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Okay? Now the question that you have to write on is, do you think it works? The threat of hell, do you think it works to make people behave morally better? 3 reasons why you think it works, 3 reasons why you don't think that it works. And again, remind yourself on your notes, you want to be sure in each one of your 3 POVs, you quote from the text, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I'm reminded of a student of mine, not a student, a colleague of mine, who many years ago told me a story. She was in her 40s when she told me this story. She said, when I was about 7 years old, I went to a summer vacation Bible school. You've maybe heard of these kinds of things where kids go to, in the summertime, they go to some kind of religious assembly. She said, all of us were taken down into the basement. And a little, a TV set was there. And the woman came in front of all of us kids and said, if you are not good, little boys and girls, this is what will happen to you. And she hit the play button on the video camera, on the video player. Somebody in that group was a fireman and had acquired a videotape of someone on fire, burning on fire. She said she remembers, she was 7 at the time. She said, I remember everything about this moment when this poor person was on fire, being videotaped, and was screaming and burning and rolling around on the floor. She said, it seemed to me that it went on for a really long time. She said, I can remember everything. I can tell you the color of the carpet I was sitting on. I can remember the smell in the room. She said, it's amazing. I'm in my 40s. And she said, I can still go back to this moment with great vivid memories. Then they hit the stop button, turned around and said one more time, you better be good little boys and girls and obey your moms and your dads, or you will go to hell and this is what will happen to you. It's basically John Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God for 7-year-olds, if you get my drift.
There's some legal complications.
Two kind of interesting observations I should point out. One of those is, this woman confided to me that she was an atheist. She did not believe in God. That begs the question, did this work or not? But the second thing is more interesting. She remembered it long, long after the fact. She remembered this moment. It stayed in her memory. The question you're being asked to write on is this question. Do you think you can, quote unquote, scare the hell out of someone? Now follow what I just asked. That's this question. Page 126, number 7. Do you think that you can actually scare someone with the threat of afterlife hell, so much so that individuals then behave morally correct? In other words, you're maybe about to go to the store and to steal something without paying for it, and then all of a sudden the thought occurs to you, oh yeah, remember John Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God says, if I do this and I die, I could end up in hell. Do you think it works? That's the question. Why or why not? Okay? Why or why not? So that's the fundamental question you'll be writing about. In your thesis then, your thesis will run something like, John Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God suggests that the threat of hell leads to proper or better morality. Or, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God suggests that you can't really make people more moral by threatening them with the punishment of afterlife. You have to take a position on this one way or the other. Then, you have to come up with 3 reasons why you believe what you believe. You want to, again, make sure you use quotes from the text, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Do I have any questions about this paper of tomorrow? Okay. Remember, the other paper of tomorrow is the My Access number 1, which is not Crucible, even though that was given to you in the handout. It's rather, what do you think it means to be an American? And again, you're going to type the paper up, you're going to submit it, you only get 1 submission, then you're going to remember print the proper printout for me so that I have 2 things. I got to have your essay, and I got to have your percentage score of what My Access scored your paper at. All right? Now let's turn to our study and viewing of the Crucible. If you did any annotations over Crucible Act 1, let's go to them now. We are taking in class notes. If you have not done any annotations over Crucible Act 1, go to a blank sheet of paper, and at the top of it, there you will put, of course, Crucible Act 1. We will begin, first of all, by defining the word crucible. We will begin by defining this word. Now, some of you are maybe familiar with the word that's kind of close. What is the word that's kind of close to crucible that you're familiar with? Crucifix. Now, what is a crucifix? You might jot that one down. If you've heard that word before, what is a crucifix? Mr. Garza, are you familiar with that word? What is a crucifix? You've probably heard the word, right? We've probably heard the word before. Mr. Denise, do you know what a crucifix is? What is that word? You're probably familiar with it if you ever watch one of those scary movies about exorcism where they try and get the demon out of some little girl and they hold up a crucifix in front of her. What does that mean? Hold up a cross. You got it. So a cross is a crucifix. Now etymologically, crucifix and crucible come from very close families of origination roots. What is a crucible? I'm going to assume that in your annotation work, Ms. Hepp, that you actually looked in your little dictionary at the word crucible. So you would be able to tell us what the meaning of the word. Mr. Nolan? Mr. Nolan says K-N-O-W. Let's define it real quickly, shall we, Mr. Denise? Crucible has 2 definitions if you look it up in the dictionary. Constance is always learning new vocab words. This is a new one for her today. 2 meanings to the word crucible. 1, if you are going to melt precious metals like gold, the bowl that you put it in to melt it, because you're going to heat it up, aren't you? The bowl is actually called a crucible. All right? That bowl that you would actually hold gold inside of, and then you would heat it with fire. Obviously, the bowl itself can't catch on fire, right? It's got to be strong enough to be able to heat whatever's inside without catching itself on fire. That's a crucible. The other definition that you'll see if you go to the dictionary is that a crucible is a difficult task or a challenging test, where when you get to the end of the test, you're kind of a different person. It's like an experience that kind of changes you or tests your ability. We might ask at 3B, have you ever had an experience which when you finished with it, it kind of changed you in some way. It made you a different kind of person. You learned really important things. For example, I mentioned Constance. Constance is our foreign exchange student from France. She is coming to the United States to spend a year. A question, if I were to drop your can right now into Paris and tell you you can't come home for 1 whole year and they only speak French, no English, you got to speak French for the entire year. Some of you would say, come December, I would already be ready to go home. And they would say, no, you don't get to go home until next June. See, all of a sudden, Mr. Drollinger's thinking, oh, so coming to America for an exchange is kind of a crucible. You bet it is. Absolutely right. And anybody that's done any kind of traveling, or you got dropped into a new school, for example, you know how challenging that experience can be. We would call it not just a challenging experience, we would call it a crucible. Now, what is this play about and who wrote it? Good question. I'm glad you asked it. The play is written by a guy named Arthur Miller. We will begin our junior year together with Miller. We will end our junior year in May with Miller. No kidding. The play that we begin with is the play Crucible. The play we end with in May, Death of a Salesman. Both of these plays, Death of Salesman and Crucible, both of these plays written by this famous American playwright Miller. Now, he writes the play, this is important for your notes, he writes the play in the 1950s of America. He's an American playwright. He writes the play in the 1950s, but he sets the play during the time in American history that we call the Salem, that's the name of a town, witch trials. Salem witch trials. Okay? Now, Salem is a small town, all right, during this time period that we call the Puritan time period. Now, Miller was very interested in two things when he wrote this play, and you want to write these down because they're going to help you to watch the play. One, Miller was very interested in this thing we call mass or group hysteria. Hysteria. What is mass hysteria? Does anyone know what that means? No one of you at all familiar with that term? Mass hysteria or group hysteria. What does it mean to you? Mass hysteria. People freaking out. That's a good way to write it down. Groups of people freaking out. When a group of people start to behave in kind of freaked out ways, some of you are, for example, maybe you heard in the news last week, there were people in certain countries in the Middle East who got really upset about a video that was made and posted on YouTube. It portrayed Islam and the Holy Prophet Muhammad not so good, and these people got together and they went nuts. They started killing people, tearing up stuff. That's what we mean by mass hysteria. Miller was very interested in this, how normal people would never misbehave individually, but when you put them in a group with several other people, they start to act really freaked out. We're going to study about how mass hysteria works. You're going to see it almost right away. When you watch this play, you immediately are going to identify group hysteria, when a bunch of people start acting really weird. Two, this is not only a play about that, and by the way, why Miller wanted to write this play in the 1950s, we'll talk about when we get to the end of the play. It had something to do with what was going on in American political thought at the time. We will look at that time period of the 1950s, and we'll ask, why did he write this play? And several of us will collectively go, I get it, it'll make sense. But number two, Miller was very interested in you seeing in this play a love story. This is a love story, and you're going to want to pay close attention to the lead protagonist, the guy about whom the play is mostly focusing on, a guy named John Proctor. Now, John Proctor has a wife. She'll be referred to often as Goody Proctor. Goody is just another word for Mrs. Okay? But John Proctor has a terrible secret. All right, a terrible secret. This secret is going to be at the heart of the conflict of the play. John Proctor does have a wife, but he also has messed around with another woman. A younger girl, and her name is Abigail. And Abigail is going to have a certain response when John Proctor says to her, we're not messing around anymore. Okay? So as we study the play, you can put it this way in your notes. As we study the play, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at sociology, how a group behaves. We're also going to look at psychology, how the individual mind behaves. All right? And one of the reasons why we study this play is that Miller is able to kind of deal with both strengths simultaneously. Simultaneously. It's quite a fascinating play in that regards. All right? So welcome to the Crucible. It will help you to appreciate the Crucible that you read, John Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Okay? We'll see some contiguity, some carryover. All right? So let's go now to the viewing of the play itself.